Hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown, where we talk about the upcoming cards from the Flame of Zolta, where they fit, what they do, and how good they are in the context of the current game and meta. So, we are looking at a bunch of new cards from Flame of Zolta. We have the new mechanic out. It is called Decimate, and Decimate is going to be an interesting one, but first things first, we have a bunch of spoilers to break down. There's a lot of cool stuff to be working with. We know that there is a strong Nightmare Dragons theme in Flame of Zolta. In fact, it appears that the big bad of Flame of Zolta is none other than Voprex, which I'm terribly delighted to have learned. And that means that there are going to be some more dragon cards in this set, and that includes Dragon Forge, which says draw a dragon or weapon of your choice from your deck and reduce its cost by 1 as a fast spell. This card's pretty decent. Not only does it pick up 5-cost dragons, which is one of the most important sort of setups for dragons. There's a lot of good 5-cost setups that you can actually do some decent things with. Like, this is just a card that can actually grab a really useful weapon or dragon for you on your opponent's turn, which is the important thing, because you leave power open for removal. You either throw the removal or you grab the dragon that you need, and then the dragon is reduced by 1. So the most obvious option here, of course, is the 4/4 with quick draw and charge Eclipse Dragon that gets you the extra +3 power at end of turn. Not only is that card great to pull off of Dragon Forge because it costs 4 on the next turn, meaning you can play it immediately and then have that board position, but also that card enables you to cast more Dragon Forges, which means that you can pick up more dragons, reduce their costs, and just have a delightful time with it. I think that alone makes this card a shoo-in for big dragon decks. It's a really, really good toolkit card. It plays really well, particularly in armory setups, because you can pick out any sort of relic weapon that you might need, and then also make that relic weapon cost quite a bit less. Using Dragon Forge to suddenly fetch something like Sword of the Sky King for 7 is definitely not a bad deal, but also if you're picking up like an Auric Runehammer for 3 early in the game, that's really not too terrible of an idea either. And since you get to choose between dragons or weapons, there's a decent amount of extra stuff that you can do, and you can even run some cards like Eclipse Dragon in the deck to support that sort of relic weapon strategy. So dragons, weapons, relic weapons, all really good options for Dragon Forge. This card is tempo inefficient, but it's not very tempo inefficient. Fast spells have this nice little function where basically they tend to be a lot more forgiving in terms of what kind of power you are spending, and they allow you to basically leave power open to spend cards like torches and other types of fast spells, while also, like, then if you don't have the ability to do that, or you don't have an optimal method, you can play Dragon Forge, get the extra cost benefit, and since Dragon Forge costs 3 but reduces its cost by 1, it only costs about 2 overall. Does accumulate some interesting turns, but overall for like control decks and fire, this is a really, really interesting option, and fire control feels a lot more viable, as do most Nightmare Dragons, as a result of this card existing. So I'm pretty into Dragon Forge. This is a really, really fun card that also makes dragons just a lot better, and making dragons a lot better is definitely something that you want to see. Speaking of making dragons a lot better, let's talk about some dragons. Dread Hellkite is a 4/3 flying deadly that can't block, but when you summon it, you play Cowardice on the enemy unit, preventing that unit from attacking. So removal attached to a unit that also cannot block. So you can't block with the unit, but you can attack with it. Your opponent can attack, but they can block. So basically the idea here is to shut off ground units while attacking over the head with flying units. This is real complicated in its overall execution, and I'm sometimes a little loath to compare it to cards like Impending Doom, which is a 5/5, or Mazag Waking Terror, which I believe is a 6/4 along those lines, although it does have that ridiculous sacrifice effect ability. On the whole, I think this card might actually be a little bit stronger than those two, just because the deadly ability does trade really well with a lot of annoying green flyers. The torch ability of the card is really, really worrisome, but like, this card is pretty aggressive and comes with its own pre-built attachment based removal. And not only that, but it is curse removal, which means that you can support some other curse-based strategies in blue, green, and purple for Unseen and Dragons together, or Cultists and Dragons together, if you are so inclined. So yeah, this card's really interesting. I do think that 3 health is a pretty big problem, as is the fact that it cannot block. But other than that, the stats line up pretty well. I wouldn't be surprised to see this card buffed a little bit, but I also think that it's reasonably strong on its own, and the Cowardice is actually like a really good reason to play the card, even if the stat line on it is not that impressive. So draws removal, is removal, and is also a unit on its own. Usually going to get you some card advantage. Has reasonable tempo and pressure because it's a flyer. Trades with Sandstorm Titan, which is pretty important for flyers, I think. And overall, really not too bad. Yeah, overall, I'm pretty into that one. Okay, FacelessOne. FacelessOne is a 2/1, can't block, but if you have a Shadow Influence at all, then when it's discarded, you play it from your void. I'm kind of surprised by just one Shadow Influence being the necessary requirement here to sort of set up FacelessOne, but hey, so this card is very, very easy and very, very cheap way to get a 2/1. Like, you can put this in your hand and discard it. You can discard it from your void. It's very, very good. It's really, really good at being aggressive. You got the Sporefolk thing going on. Anything where you are self-milling yourself or where your opponent is milling you. Anything where you're forced to discard it for some reason. Shakedown when you actually have, like, nothing but faceless ones in hand is kind of cute. There's a lot of interesting ways that this card might be forcibly discarded by your opponent, but also mostly you're going to be doing it to yourself in your self-mill decks, and this gives you a way to defend those self-mill strategies so you can set up for better means to an end or whatever else that you would like to sort of do with your ridiculous self-mill. There's some definite self-mill strategies already in existence in Flame of Zolta. I don't remember the specific cards, but certainly they do exist, and FacelessOne is something that defends those strategies really well, while also potentially being something that you can constantly resurface and restructure. I like it in Xenon Invoke the Waystones type deck, since it probably will both enter the void and enter like a enter play, meaning that you can trigger Azendel with it and do some pretty wild stuff with that. Seems like a really good addition to those decks and gives you a lot more overall aggression. Stat line's not bad for a 1-drop. A base 2/1 is actually a good stat line for a 1-drop, even if it doesn't have a lot of interesting things. The fact that it can't block is something that I missed until literally just this moment, and does make it quite a bit worse, but at least it's something that you can aggress with and do some nice things with Combust and Devour and other things like that. Yeah, I think this card is really decent, even though it can't block. The fact that it can't defend your strategies, as I was saying before, is not that amazing, but yeah, it is nonetheless capable of being a reasonable option to devour and turn into card advantage, to turn into life advantage, and to turn into all sorts of interesting sacrifice effects. And it is a cultist that exists to be sacrificed, sometimes as often as twice. So very, very cool, and certainly a reasonable option in self-mill strategies if you are going for that particular setup. All right, the big one, there's a couple of big ones going on here, but we got some good mastery cards, and we also have this ridiculous nonsense Kairos Grand Champion, which, oh boy, 9 cost, Praxis colors, 12/12, which is, I believe, as big as units get in Eternal. I'm not sure that there is another 12/12 aside from Spirit of Resistance, which is... Actually, that might be a 10/10. This might actually be the biggest unit that currently exists in Eternal. I feel like there's one other 12/12, but +6 maximum power, which on its own, not too bad. When you play another unit, it deals its strength and damage to an enemy, which can be a unit or a player, and summon, draw cards equal to the highest strength among your other units. I fail to see how you can play this card and not almost immediately win the game. Like, you do have to wait for another turn to really get the kind of value that you're looking for, but like, this card will refresh your hand as long as you have like a Sentinel out, and that is a wild thing to be doing at 9. Like, this is a reason to End of the Barrel, this is a reason to Eternity Core, this is a reason to do a lot of the like really big, ridiculous, strong things. I like it. I think it's really interesting. I think it's a lot stronger than cards, or a lot more interesting than cards like Martyr's Chains and Temporal Distortion, which have typically been the top end for Praxis, and I think this is like a really interesting place to go with it. But also, like, that card will win you the game very, very quickly once it's out. Like, if it doesn't die immediately, which it probably won't. It's a 12/12. It's hybrid colors, and you're playing it basically at the end of your curve when people's removal is starting to get really, really like locked down. Once you play this down, you then get to just like absolutely wreck everything, and it sets up pretty well for some interesting like alternate turn options. Any units that you play are going to just be absolutely ridiculous and also remove other units. This card is essentially the Martyr's Chains on a stick that you would like to see. The fact that it is vulnerable to removal means it's a better design than Mars Chain, certainly, and like overall it's just really, really exciting. It's a big Timmy card. The +6 maximum power is really, really fun, gets you straight up to 15, which is enough to do like Ironthorn shenanigans. Now you can actually do like green, red, yellow Ironthorn. Yay! I'm in. That sounds fun. Yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting things going on with Kairos Grand Champion. This card seems like it could easily even be in a tier 1 deck, although 9 is an awful lot to ask for in a tier 1 deck. Notably not a Sentinel, so can't be reduced in cost or like have a lot of the general synergies going on with it. It is a giant, but nonetheless, it is a really powerful card and a very, very good curve topper for Praxis, where previously the curve topper for Praxis was Heart of the Vault, which you'd probably still be playing with Kairos Grand Champion. Not only do you get to play the card and then reduce the cost of Kairos to 7, which, ouch, but also like it also behaves very well with Kairos because you can deal 6 damage to one thing, 2 damage to another, and then get more cards to play for Kairos that are going to do other ridiculous things. So yeah, wild amount of stuff going on with this card. It's a strong reason to run cards like End of the Barrel and any sort of interesting ramp stuff. This is the ramp payoff that Praxis really wants, and I think it's quite ridiculous, even if it is somewhat vulnerable the way that big finishers should be. I love this card. I think it's quite good. Okay, yeah, so we got some really, really good Mastery and Muster cards revealed. One of these is Sony the Metamorph. At the start of your turn, draw a card, muster, replenish your power. So right away, like, that start of your turn, draw a card is insane. Like, that is a really, really good thing to have on a 3-drop. You do have to play triple time and triple primal influence on a 3-drop to get it, which means you have to be very, very deep in Elysian, banners, seats, insignias, and crests all at once to reliably play this on 3, and even then, it might be a bit of a long shot, but nonetheless, like if you're playing stuff like Trailmaker, if you're playing any amount of like good fixing, you can usually get this card out pretty early, and then if it doesn't die to a torch, it immediately starts gaining you value in a way that's very, very beneficial. The muster ability is not as important, but it does mean that you can essentially play Spellcraft card for free every turn, particularly the card draw card that gives you Equivocate, which means that there is a very strong raw Elysian spellcraft deck in the works for Sony the Metamorph that is going to be very, very easy to build on day one. You can just throw in Sony, get in all of your good spellcraft cards, stuff like Staff of Speed, stuff like the Equivocate spellcraft card, which I believe is actually called Sodi's something or other, and yeah, then like combine with that with the muster ability to replenish your power consistently while drawing a bunch of cards, getting a bunch of aggressive stuff out, and playing lots of weapons and units all together. It's a fun time, really, really simple design path. I like this card a lot. I think the design of it's really interesting, and I think that overall it's a fun card to play down and try to defend with like counter spells and stuff. A free card a turn is a lot to work with, and this is the cheapest that is effect has ever been in play. So like basically just running a deck with Backlash or Unseal, Swift Refusal, that kind of thing, and actually just trying to keep Sodi alive is a real strategy for control that could actually be a lot of fun. You still have to get the influence together, so it's not going to happen immediately, but you generally want to play this card on 5 anyways, so I think that's well worth the look. And if you're playing in an aggressive deck and you manage to get it down on 3, God forbid your opponent doesn't have a torch. That is just going to be a very rough day. Okay. The Mastery cards are really, really fun too. Burstspore Fern, one of my favorite designs so far out of Flame of Zolta. Aegis and Overwhelm, Mastery 10 for the rest of the game when you play a spell. Play an additional copy of it. So you can refresh this a lot of times if you have ways to recur it, like End of Hostilities or Mirror Image or any number of other things. You can also do that by mirror imaging it while it's at 5, which if it's attacked once seems very, very likely. And then at that point you suddenly have a duplication deck that can duplicate things many, many times by playing multiple copies of Mirror Image or multiple Channel the Tempests. Like if you want to just finish your opponent off by going channel into channel into channel, I don't know if I assume they all go off at once, so I'm not sure how much damage that would deal, but whew, that is a beater, and what a fun beater it is too. Stat line on it is good. The Aegis and Overwhelm are really, really strong. It plays well with Divining Rod Overwhelm, which is always delightful. This card's very ridiculous and could even be like a little bit overpowered for the kind of stuff that it's providing. The one thing I can say about it is that if the Mastery goes off, it's not like a huge deal immediately, but it is something that actually sticks around even if Burstspore Fern That's an interesting question, actually. If Burstspore Fern has to be alive for the Mastery 10 to be alive, then that could be silly, but I'm pretty sure that by that wording, that should just go off as a global effect, and you'll basically always be able to play Burstspore Fern. Even if Burstspore Fern is removed, you should be able to get the extra spell. Yeah, because for the rest of the game would indicate that it doesn't have to be alive. But yeah, it's interesting that they don't provide a relic or something along those lines for that effect. Still, pretty cool stuff. You definitely get some really, really cool benefits from it. I love the card. It's got a lot of permanent value, and it's also a reasonable 6-drop to play early on just because it's got that nice Aegis ability and that nice Overwhelm ability. Certainly a fun card to be playing with. I look forward to seeing Huru beaters with it. I also look forward to seeing Elysian beaters with it, since we've already seen some really cool Elysian stuff. Speaking of Elysian beaters, we have another Elysian Mastery card here, which is Ela and Bizo. And this one is a little too small, but that's okay. 5 cost, 6/6, Endurance, Mastery 12, play a copy of Ela and Mizo. Same thing, double attacks, but if your opponent has any way to reduce the cost or aggression of it a little bit, then it's not going to do quite as good. Notably, the thing that's interesting about this card is that permanent buffs on it mean that multiple copies of Ela and Mizo are ridiculous, and also that copy does get refreshed mastery, so you're gonna get even more ridiculous nonsense happening. Get this card up to a 12/12 with, like, say, augmented form, and just hit somebody with it once, and then you've suddenly got another 12/12 that's going to play another 12/12 on your next turn, and so on and so forth. You got some wild stuff going on with it, and I think that there's a really interesting amount of play with it. This is one of the weaker mastery cards that we've seen, but it's also one of the more fun. And what's wrong with Explorer Dinosaur? Nothing at all. It's beautiful. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous fun card to play for Timmies, and I think that it's got a lot of potential as a 5-cost 6/6, although it's pretty hard to replace the Cerso slot for the overall amount of damage. Like, this thing's just wildly good, but not as good as some of the other, like, ridiculous Elysian big guys that have existed in the current setup. Okay, yeah, we also have Hanako Loremaster, one more Master card. Mastery 6, draw a relic weapon of your choice from the deck, and +1/+1 for each of your other Oni. I don't know if I'm too wild about this card. We already have a lot of Oni deck stuff happening, and there's a lot of, like, Oni tribal going on with the Oni, but the main thing about it is that it all kind of just doesn't quite work because there's so few good Onis that are just good on their own. Hanako Loremaster is another example of something that really doesn't quite work like that. It's a 2-drop that is sometimes a 2/2, sometimes a 3/3, usually not much bigger than that. And then, like, after it gets Mastery 6, you draw a free relic weapon of your choice from your deck, which is, at this point, not a hard thing to do, and also there are cheaper ways to do it. Overall, I'm a little bit down on this card. Like, the body on it is pretty minimal. It dies to Vara's Favor pretty early. You can just go, like, Vara's Favor or Torch. You can do lots of things to kill Hanaka pretty quickly, and, like, this thing is just, like, boof. It's like, yeah, if you got a lot of tiny Onis, then the relic weapon's not as good, so it's not as worth it to have a big, like, 2-drop Oni. And, like, removing Oni is very easy at the moment. Suffocate, Torch, all of that kind of stuff. Any counter aggro stuff is just going to make Hanako Loremaster not look that amazing. I don't know. I don't think this card really plays very well, and it seems like it's probably not going to be a lot of fun to play with. But, and, like, when you're getting the mastery is just not that exciting for Oni, so I kind of wish it had a better mastery ability or at least a better stat line, but either of those would be a little bit more improved. Still, yeah, Oni are just never quite there, and this one doesn't look like it's going to get him there, so we'll see. We'll see. Still, Green Oni. I do love Green Oni because there's that new +5/+5 card, which I think people are sleeping on, and overall it's an interesting option to be sure. Okay, so that's all the big spoilers. Let's look at the little spoilers now. We got some mastery stuff to be sure. Let's okay, back to Dragonforge. We're gonna hide that. All right. So the main thing to be talking about, I think we have a couple of other stragglers to pick up as well. I think it's a +4/+4. But yeah, like so Decimate. Let's talk about Decimate. Decimate is another ability on Flame of Zolta, which specifically reads that when you play this card, you may reduce your maximum power by 1 to give it an additional effect. So, for example, Casted Shadow functions as a slay that also can kill curses, or it functions as an annihilate that can also kill curses. But if you reduce your maximum power by 1 when you play it, then you will also be able to kill a second unit or curse with the same single faction. That is definitely not nothing. Like, paying 3 to just blow up 2 of your opponent's units as a fast spell is a pretty wild thing and makes monocolor like a lot weaker in general. The main problem, of course, with this, of course, is that you lose the maximum power, so you don't accelerate into a lot of the like later parts of your deck. If you are playing a lot of maximum power through means like Lost Scroll or trying to like buff your maximum power up in ways using other cards, then there are some ways that you can actually get decent amounts of Decimate benefits and basically just like overplay your power and play into control, and you'll have this kind of interesting swing to your deck. But more often, Decimate is going to be a pretty aggro strategy where you specifically sacrifice your future to sacrifice something in the to get something good in the present. I don't like that type of design. I'm really not a fan of this skill in general. I think that this is like a real awkward payoff or a real awkward cost for most types of decks. Like, if you aren't playing really aggressive with Cast into Shadow, then playing this in control feels a little bit weirder. There are some things about it that are nice. Like, I would say that like if you're up on 9 power or 8 power, it's fine to just cut off some of your maximum power. Oftentimes this is a solution to Flood, where you are playing control type stuff and you're just drawing too much power overall, but then you have these spells that are worth twice as much or even more than twice as much if you can just spend an extra power, so you're really happy to draw more power. And since Flood is a consistent problem in Eternal, that's something that really can sort of create some good situations where you can just run a lot more power in your deck, and then because your deck has really good payoffs for all that power, you get some decent benefits out of it. But overall, like, it just feels pretty bad to pay that kind of cost to get some sort of interesting benefit there, and like I feel like a lot of times making that choice is not going to be a pleasant experience. That being said, it's a really spiky ability, and probably a lot of the cards that you are playing it with are going to be really beneficial. Cast into Shadow seems like something that is absolutely ridiculous. The overall influence cost of it means that it's pretty hard to play on 3, but if you're playing it on 3 into like a War Leader type build, you can just blow out your opponent in such a ridiculous fashion that it doesn't really matter that you lost the maximum power, because you are like way up on everything else and doing just a wild amount of cool stuff. And also it works pretty well in interesting control lists, so I think both of those are interesting. And some of the other Decimate cards that have been revealed are also on the unusual and interesting side. So here's Draw Strength. Draw Strength is pay 1 to give one of your units +1/+1 this turn for each enemy unit as a fast spell. It also has Decimate. The top 3 units of your deck get +1/+1. I think this one's a little bit more interesting as an example of like how flexible and weird Decimate can get. In a really hyper aggro list, this card is a pretty quick trick that will basically get one of your units above your opponent's units in strength, while also giving you a little bit of long-term value with the extra +1/+1. But at the same time, like, you're not going to be playing 4 drops in these games or 5 drops in these games. Paying the Decimate could potentially really hurt you, so it might just end up being something that is a slightly worse or occasionally slightly better Finest Hour. I think that Draw Strength has like all of this interesting flexibility and value to it, but I also think that most of the time it's not going to be as strong as Finest Hour, and often in the times where it is stronger than Finest Hour, you're already losing the game to such an extent that Draw Strength may not be the card that you're looking for. Like, if your opponent has 4 units and you're attacking with a unit with the expectation of getting +4/+4 off of Draw Strength, then they probably are going to be in a position to trade pretty well with it anyways, so it's hard to see if this card is going to get you the value that you want in the situations that you want it. That being said, like, the Decimate ability is also not that great. Like, the loss of power for a little bit of an extra bonus on aggression is mediocre. Like, mostly you want to be able to play like a 2-drop into another 2-drop on turn 4, and being able to have like 2 2-drops that are +1/+1, but then you can only play one of them is maybe a little bit weaker. So I'm not certain that Draw Strength is quite there in terms of other Decimate cards, and this is an example of like the kind of like really difficult choices that that Decimate creates that I think might be a little bit unpleasant overall to play. But yeah, I don't think this card is going to see like super competitive play, but I could be wrong. The Decimate ability is stronger than it looks, to be certain, and there's some interesting options there that could definitely get you a little bit further along. We do have a promo card, which goes berserk whenever you decimate, but does not have decimate itself. We also have Reconnaissance here. Reconnaissance... Ooh, let's see if you can stick. Reconnaissance? Okay. Something wrong with my setup, but that's okay. Reconnaissance. Give one of your units +2 strength and unblockable this turn. Decimate when it hits the enemy player this turn. You can draw the top card of your deck. So not only does it get unblockable, but also you get a free card out of Reconnaissance provided you are willing to sacrifice 1 power to do it. So you get decent amounts of aggression on potentially a double damage unit. Play this in like Winchest with Reconno Smuggler or the Reconno Smuggler, which is Red Canyon Smuggler, and then you get 8 damage across, you get to draw a new card, and you have to spend 1 less power, but you also have access to some pretty good like 3-drop spells or other interesting things that you can do some pretty wild stuff with. This is a bit more interesting as far as Decimate goes. Unblockability on a single unit has typically never been a strong stat line, and this is also something that as a temporary effect that also might require you to toss some power out is maybe not going to be that great. I feel like a lot of these cards have been pushed and they've never really managed to succeed just because single target removal shuts them down so hard, but it's a really interesting draft option that really makes some viable Decimate plays happen. And as far as like doing this in draft, like, yeah, you're going to be pretty excited to do this in draft when you're flooding out on power and you are just like looking at a deck where you just want to get some damage across and you want to play more cards. Those two things are both important, so seems like a really reasonable option in the limited environment. You can do some pretty wild things with it. Okay. The big Decimate card is probably the one that we'll finish out on, but we can also talk about a couple of cards that don't have Decimate. Snapping Hydrangea is a 2-cost 5/5 that when you summon it, the enemy player plays 4 1/1 cultists. 4 1/1 cultists are generally always better than a 5/5 for 2, but if you can kill them immediately afterwards, then this is a reasonable option to do some interesting things with. I would say that the thing to do with this is probably play it with a Corendon deck where you have Display of Vision in easy access, and you can also do some things like even play Plague or anything along those lines. You can just get Plague. I can never say Plague. Anything where you can get like a sort of Lightning Storm type effect, Elysian with Lightning Storm or Tamaris, or the scouting setups. Just make sure that you can kill the cultists quickly and they don't get buffed by like Obelisk or something along those lines, because that's going to be a pretty wild setup. That being said, if you're spending the entire turn killing the cultists that you just generated from your 5/5, this may not be the card for you, because you might just want to play a False Prince or something on 3 that also has a lot of value to it. Still, it's interesting, and the ability to play the additional cultists, if you can in some way make that a disadvantage for your opponent, that's really exciting, and there's a lot of interesting possibilities there. Do you need your opponent to have a lot of units in their void? Do you need them to have a lot of units on board so that you can make some sort of interesting balance effect happen? There are definitely ways to sort of consider cultists being a little bit better. This card could be better with future sets as well as with other sets, or you could just like do some other interesting and wild stuff. It's pretty fun. It is a 5/5, so it triggers card draw very quickly off of Friendly Wisp. You can do Dawnwalkers with it. You can do some interesting things. I think this is the cheapest 5-attack unit in the game, and it also has a lot of stats to go with it, so certainly a lot of fun. Okay. I don't think we covered Perul's Choice. I'm not sure if we covered Perul either, so let's go ahead and look at Perul's Choice first. Perul's Choice is a 2-cost. It is a choice, which means that there's a cycle of choice. Most likely Perul, Sodi, and the new guy, the one that we just saw. What is his name? Doop doop. The big guy. I've lost it. It's fine. For some reason, I can't even find that card anymore. Kairos. So yeah, we might see a Kairos, we might see a Perul. I haven't figured out exactly what 5 or 6 cards are going to have choices in this setup, but yeah, we do have choices, which means a modal spell that does 2 different things. The 2 things that are here are very, very good. One of them is a Protect with a +1/+1, meaning a mini Stand Together. That's a really, really beneficial effect. You'll often play Stand Together on even just one unit to protect it from a spell, and so this is probably the most efficient and interesting Aegis type effect that there currently exists in the game. The only other one that like even competes is Fetch's Bravery, and that's a card that specifically has to have a weapon on the unit to work. So I think this is really flexible just on the value of that bottom card alone. But drawing a curse of your choice from your deck that you haven't played this game can also be beneficial. You can pick up a quick Permafrost or some other thing and do some wild stuff. Who's Perul? Someone asks, and yeah, let's go ahead and talk about that as well. Perul Sealkeeper is our Gunseen. Gunslinger Unseen, because if there's one thing that defines a sneaky ninja, it's a loud revolver. 6 cost 5/5, triple green, triple blue. Endurance, your griffins deal double damage. That's a griffin with 2 eyes. 1 in the front, 1 in the back. I think that might be a legitimate spelling of griffin, but it still makes me smile because there's definitely griffins with just 2 eyes, griffins with 1 eye, griffins with 1 Y. I think you can spell it so many different ways. I find that really funny that it's griffin with 2 Ys. Anyways, your griffins deal double damage. Summon, play a griffin with flying and strength and health equal to the number of curses on the enemy player and their units. So good in green, blue, purple curses. Unseen curses is definitely a thing that's happening. Playing with Permafrost is certainly quite strong, and there's a couple of other cards that really support that sort of curse-based strategy. This card seems reasonable, but also like the summon ability is not that important. I would say that overall it's a little underpowered for some of the other things that are going on, and since Gunslingers are not that supported in blue, it's a little bit hard to say that this card is going to make a lot of good things happen. That being said, a free flyer that also can potentially have double damage on top of a 5/5 endurance unit on the ground, that's certainly not an unreasonable amount of things to happen. And since you can be playing quite a decent amount of curses, even getting like a 2/2 or a 3/3 griffin would be a pretty good deal with Perul, and probably well worth your time if you can actually get it going, because you get a good blocker, decent stat line that doesn't trade amazingly well. The main problem here is that like Sandstorm Titan exists, and if you're playing a 2/2 griffin and a Perul Sealkeeper off of your multiple curses, you're sitting on some Permafrosts, and you've got Perul Sealkeeper, Griffins, and Permafrosts, and all of those cards are dead against Sandstorm Titan. That gets to be a little bit awkward. So like there's some basic things that might be a little bit at issue here, but in an expedition format this is much more interesting. Anything where like 6/6s are not quite as valuable, or where flyers are a lot more valuable, this could be a lot more interesting and potentially do quite a bit more. I do like that it's a 5/5. I think that green in particular has had a lot of overstated cards for a while, so this is something that is a little bit more in line and also has like a pretty reasonable effect. Shouldn't be too ridiculously strong, but is pretty fun overall. Okay. Yeah, so that leaves the big Decimate card as our finisher. This is Soul's Rest. May actually not be the best one to win out on, because I'm not terribly fond of it. But nonetheless, 8 cost, Voidbound, take an additional turn after this one, and Decimate, put each unit into its owner's hand. So with the Decimate ability, you sacrifice maximum power, but every single unit on board goes back to its owner's hand, leaving you the freedom of the board to do a bunch of aggressive charge stuff, or just a little bit of aggressive charge stuff, and then continue to Soul's Rest over and over again, provided you have a ton of maximum power to do so with. Overall, I'm not a big fan of spells that read take an additional turn after this one. I really liked Talir's design, but I think that like in general, if you're just like able to pay for a free spell, that can get really frustrating really fast whenever the card is good, and like basically just like it comes out of nowhere and then it does ridiculous amounts of things. This card, if you are ahead on board, is quite strong, and even without the Decimate you can do some pretty wild stuff with it. I would say that the Decimate itself is probably not the thing that you want to be doing most of the time. You probably want to be just like aggressing in a situation where you're already pretty far ahead. You're playing like your Lava Blood Goliaths and your Great Kiln Titans, maybe you're actually playing a Sentinel deck that plays cards out of the top of your deck with Lava Blood Goliath. Like if you are playing the Explorer on 2 into a turn 4 Stirring Sands so that you can set up a Lava Blood Goliath, and then Lava Blood Goliath plays Soul's Rest, you then get to not only Decimate if you choose, which would not be that great an idea, but you then get to play more Soul's Rests off the top of your deck and do like wild amounts of things. You can set up weird Diogo combos with this. You can do all sorts of interesting things and just get free turns, and that can be a lot of fun. I don't think the card's ridiculously overpowered, but I do think that in a situation where it does become ridiculously overpowered, it becomes a bit of a problem. That being said, right now it looks like it's kind of fun. I think there's a lot of things that you can do with it, and like there are a lot of like entertaining control decks and mid-range decks that you can do some interesting things with. Overall, this is the card that I think I'm most worried about in the set, but it's also one of the more interesting time shenanigans to be playing around with, and who doesn't love taking an extra turn every now and then. I think I really like this card the most with the Talir card that actually gives you extra turns, just because the combination of stocking power and then playing Soul's Rest and then stocking more power means that you can potentially chain a lot of extra turns together in a way that's pretty beneficial, and then accumulate power in such a way as to activate Talir for the ultimate extra turn and just do wild amounts of things. So yeah, there's some pretty interesting things to be done with this card, and certainly once you start playing it, you're going to start to dominate the game in a way that's pretty exciting. I wouldn't say it's as bad as like Temporal Distortion in terms of like toxic design. I think it's actually pretty interesting and does do some pretty wild stuff. I'm really curious to see if anyone can make this card work with the Decimate, but I also think that maybe the problem with this card is that it works pretty well without the Decimate, and that may be sort of the both issue and the draw of Soul's Rest. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Yeah, so still very excited for Flameless Ulta. It seems like there's a lot of interesting cards coming into this set, and I'm really hoping that we see some sort of rotation still. Like I would like to see Expeditions become one of the premier sort of modes at the moment, because it just feels like this is like we're getting to this point where the cards that are getting printed are really, really interesting, but also we like really kind of need to be able to play them in the context of a smaller set of cards in order to make them look as good and as fun as they really, really are. And Soul's Rest is a really good example of that, where like with an infinite pool of cards, this becomes pretty not as fun, but in the context of just like an expedition, I think this is a fascinating card that has some really, really interesting play to it. So I'm super psyched about it, and I'm looking forward to Flame Azulta. This is looking like it's going to be quite a bit of fun. Decimate is definitely the spikiest mechanic that we've seen so far. I would say that this has a lot more like straight callbacks to some of the more complicated aspects of MTG. So if you're a fan of the like sort of like really, really difficult and deep play styles of Magic, I think a lot of that is coming back in this set, and this is something where you're getting like a lot less of the sort of beady mid-range and a lot more of the unusual and sort of interestingly twisted designs that can really do some wild stuff. So yeah, it's something to look forward to. We're gonna see exactly how good this set is when it comes out, but so far it's looking like it's gonna be a fun one. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all next time with more spoiler breakdowns, maybe even some brews, hopefully. See you then, and once again, thanks so much. Cheers.